Macbeth is a play about ambition. Macbeth is a thane, which is a Scottish lord. He's the Thane of Glamis. He gets the idea that he could be king of Scotland from some witches he meets, but to do that he would have to kill the current king, Duncan. Macbeth's ambition overrides any moral qualms he has, and he murders Duncan and takes the throne. But once he's in charge, he becomes so paranoid that he's going to lose power that he starts having other people killed. Eventually everyone turns on him, even his own army, and he's killed. Here's how it happens. King Duncan listens to a report about the battle where Macbeth is fighting. He hears how Macbeth and Banquo, the Scottish generals, just defeated two separate armies, the rebel MacDonald's army and an invading army from Norway. The Norwegian army had help from a Scottish traitor, the Thane of Cawdor, so Duncan announces that the Thane of Cawdor should be executed, and his title given to Macbeth. 3 witches wait on a heath for Macbeth after the battle, and when he and Banquo ride by, the witches speak to him, calling him the Thane of Glamis, the Thane of Cawdor, and the future King of Scotland. Macbeth doesn't know at this point that he's been named the Thane of Cawdor, so he doesn't know what the witches are talking about. Banquo asks the witches if they can see his future too, and they tell him that he won't be king, but that his children will be kings. Then they vanish. Ross and Angus, 2 other thanes, arrive and tell Macbeth that the Thane of Cawdor is going to be executed, and that Macbeth will be the new Thane of Cawdor. Macbeth starts to believe the witches, since they seem to know about this before it happened. The witches also called him the future King of Scotland, so Macbeth starts to think about murdering Duncan, which makes his heart pound and his hair stand on end. This series of events creates a paradox in the play. The witches appear to know already that Macbeth will become King of Scotland, but Macbeth doesn't even consider it until he meets the witches. They put the idea in his head. So we don't know if he would have thought about being king if he hadn't met them, and it's unclear whether Macbeth's actions are fate or the result of the witches manipulating him. Macbeth and Banquo go to meet King Duncan, who thanks them for their services and promises to promote them. Duncan announces that he's making his son, Malcolm, the heir to the throne, and then he tells Macbeth he's going to visit him at his castle. Lady Macbeth reads a letter from her husband telling her about the witch's prophecy. She decides right away to make it come true. She worries that her husband is too kind-hearted to murder Duncan, which he'll have to do to become king, but she plans to persuade him. Macbeth arrives and tells her that the king is going to stay with them that night and leave the next day. She says Duncan isn't going anywhere, because he'll be dead. She tells Macbeth to act normal and leave the rest to her. After Duncan arrives, Macbeth goes off by himself and thinks about what it would mean to kill Duncan. He says if he could just do it quickly, with no consequences, he'd do it. But that's not how it works. Murderers do face consequences. Also, he has no good reason to kill Duncan, who is a guest in his home and a good king. Macbeth tells Lady Macbeth he doesn't want to go through with it, and she calls him a coward for chickening out when they have the perfect opportunity. She tells him not to worry because she'll get Duncan's servants drunk before killing him, then blame the servants. Macbeth agrees to go along with this. Macbeth waits outside Duncan's bedroom to hear Lady Macbeth ring a bell, signaling that it's time to commit the murder. He hallucinates and sees a dagger in front of him, with the handle toward his hand, which then shows splashes of blood. He hears the bell and sets off, determined to kill Duncan. After the murder, he meets Lady Macbeth outside Duncan's room. He comes out carrying 2 bloody daggers. He tells her he'll never sleep again, but she tells him to pull himself together, or he'll screw the whole thing up. She says he has to put the daggers back in the servant's room and wash the blood off his hands. He says he can't bear to see the crime scene again, so she says she'll take them and smear Duncan's blood on the servants' faces. They hear a knocking on the castle door. Macbeth says he'll never get his hands clean, and she tells him to snap out of it, wash his hands, and put on his nightgown. The porter, who opens the castle door, is drunk and fantasizes about being the gatekeeper to hell. Macduff comes in, greets Macbeth, then goes into the king's room and finds him murdered. Macbeth goes in to see, and when he comes back, he says he saw the servants with their bloody daggers, and he got so angry that he just killed them right there. While he's explaining this, Lady Macbeth faints. Duncan's 2 sons, Malcolm and Donalbain, decide to run away because they think they're in danger. Malcolm goes to England and Donalbain to Ireland. After they disappear, people suspect that they bribed the servants to kill their father. Macbeth is made king. Banquo, when he's by himself, says he suspects that Macbeth is actually the murderer, and he wonders if the witch's prophecy might come true for him, too. Macbeth comes along and tells Banquo to be sure to come to his feast that night. Macbeth wants to get rid of Banquo because the witches predicted his children would be kings. He summons 2 murderers and hires them to assassinate Banquo and his son, Flance. The 2 murderers, plus a third one sent by Macbeth, attack Banquo and Flance on their way to the feast. They kill Banquo, but Flance escapes. Macbeth has his feast. The first murderer comes in with Banquo's blood on his face and tells Macbeth that Banquo is dead, but Flance escaped. Lady Macbeth tells Macbeth to pay attention to his guests, and the lords tell him to come sit down, where they're keeping a place for him. Macbeth sees Banquo's bloody ghost in his chair and freaks out. Lady Macbeth tells the lords to ignore Macbeth, that he's always had fits like this, and they pass quickly. But Macbeth keeps seeing the ghost, and Lady Macbeth finally tells everyone to leave. Lady Macbeth scolds her husband, saying it's a hallucination, just like the bloody daggers. Macbeth says his problem is that he's not yet used to murder, and he has more blood to spill before he's finished. He says he'll go see the witches the next day to learn more. Macbeth goes to the witches and demands they answer his questions. They make spirits appear before him, who show him what's going to happen. A head wearing an armored helmet tells him to beware Macduff. A bloody child tells him to laugh at anyone who threatens him, because no one born of woman can hurt him. A child wearing a crown and holding a tree tells him he will not be defeated until Birnam Wood comes to Dunsinane Castle. Macbeth is happy because it sounds like nothing bad will happen to him, but he demands to know if Banquo's children will really be kings. A procession of 8 future kings passes in front of him, followed by Banquo. These are all the descendants of Banquo who become kings. The witches dance and disappear. Macbeth decides he's going to act boldly, so he sets off to Macduff's castle to kill him and his family. Lady Macduff complains to her friend, Ross, that her husband has fled the country, leaving her and her children defenseless. She asks her young son what he will do for a father now that his is as good as dead. A messenger comes to warn her to take her children and run away, but murderers come and kill her son and chase her off the stage. Macduff has gone to England to urge Duncan's son, Malcolm, to come back to Scotland with an army and fight Macbeth. Malcolm says Scotland would be worse off if he were king than Macbeth, because he has an insatiable lust for women, is greedy, and doesn't have any qualities of a good king. Macduff gives up, wailing about how his hopes for Scotland are dead now. But Malcolm tells him he was just testing him. He's ready to be king. In fact, he's about to leave with 10,000 soldiers. Ross brings them the news that Macduff's family has been slaughtered. Macduff blames himself for their deaths, and vows to kill Macbeth himself. A doctor and a lady who waits on Lady Macbeth watch her as she sleepwalks. She tries to wash imaginary blood off her hands, and talks about the murders of Duncan, Banquo, and Lady Macduff. In Dunsinane Castle, Macbeth hears reports that his lords are deserting to join the English armies, and that over 10,000 soldiers are approaching. Malcolm tells his soldiers to cut large boughs out of trees in the forest, so as they approach Dunsinane Castle they'll be harder to count. Macbeth hears women screaming in another room, and Seton brings the report that Lady Macbeth has killed herself. Macbeth laments that life is slow and pointless. A messenger reports that Birnam Wood seems to be marching toward Dunsinane. In the battle, things go against Macbeth because no one wants to fight for him. Macduff challenges him and they fight, until Macbeth tells him he's wasting his time, since no one born of woman can hurt him. Macduff says he wasn't born of woman. He was taken out of his mother by cesarean section. Macbeth realizes he's defeated and that the witches were misleading him. Macduff kills Macbeth and takes his head to Malcolm. Malcolm invites the other lords to Scone, where he will be crowned king. For more information about Macbeth, check out the Macbeth SparkNote on sparknotes.com. For a translation of the entire play into modern English, go to No Fear Shakespeare at nfs.sparknotes.com.